Good evening. Thank you everyone for coming. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Lisa Ryan, and I'm the Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here at Vermont Law and Graduate School. And I'm so excited to be welcoming you to the panel, Utilizing Restorative Justice Practices as a Response to Intimate Partner Violence, Vermont, a call to action for Vermont Community Justice Centers. And I'd like to take a moment and have the panelists introduce themselves. If you want to do your name, pronoun, and your organization, that would be great.
I currently work at the Attorney General's office, and I work in our office's Community Justice Unit alongside Willa Farrell and Ann Walker. And together we manage the state's diversion programs, and we also do a lot of policy work related to criminal justice reform.
Martha?
I'm Martha McLafferty. I'm the Executive Director of the Hartford Community Restorative Justice Center, which is in White River Junction. And we facilitate the Circles of Peace program along with many other restorative justice-based programs.
Hey everyone, my name is Bessie McManus. My pronouns are she, her. I am the barge coordinator at the Burlington Community Justice Center until Friday, and then I'm joining the Vermont Network, joining Karen. I'm very excited. I also am technically an alum. I finished the Marge program in March, so happy to be here. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Karen Tronsgard-Scott. I use she, they pronouns, and I work at the Vermont Network Against Domestic and Sexual Violence, where I'm the executive director. My organization was intimately involved in advocating for laws and approaches that promoted a very strong criminal legal system response. And because of the scarcity of resources, there wasn't a lot of room for any other responses outside of the criminal legal system. But shall I keep going?
Sure.
Just talk about, okay.
Yeah, go.
You know, going back to the mid-2000s, we were already hearing from survivors who were saying, this system is not meeting my needs. And some of the reasons for that was just because there was a mismatch between the expectations and desires of survivors and what the system was offering. Sometimes people were members of marginalized communities who didn't feel safe or comfortable calling the police or seeking prosecution, and those survivors were seeking other responses. They were seeking of ways to be able to find justice outside of the criminal legal system. Our organization, the network, was dead set against this idea. We advocated strongly, and I was the director back then. We advocated strongly for a state law that kept survivors from being able to access services at our growing community justice center system, and we were successful in passing that law. In 2013, Lee Goodmark published her first book, A Troubled Marriage, and she spoke here at the law school, and I remember feeling deep outrage at what she was saying. She was saying, we have to find another way. We have to think about how we serve survivors outside of the criminal legal system, and let's take a close look at a restorative justice process. Over the next several years, we interrogated our relationship with all of this at the network and within the domestic and sexual violence organizations in Vermont. And in 2015, there was a legislative study committee where we really formally interrogated our approaches and heard from a lot of survivors and others, and we came out of that study with the idea that we actually have to create pathways for survivors to be able to access restorative justice in their communities. And so here we are today, 2013. During the last legislative session, we were successful working with the Attorney General's office and the Coalition of Community Justice Centers in passing a law that creates that pathway for survivors to have access to restorative justice through Vermont's community justice centers.
Thanks so much, Karen, and thank you to the Vermont Network Against Domestic and Sexual Violence for all the work that you all do for the state of Vermont. Thanks. And that's a great segue, and I'm wondering if we can talk next about what are community justice centers and what are the roles of them here in Vermont?
Thank you. I'll begin, and then Bessie can add some things. So there are, I believe, 17 community justice centers across Vermont, and they were started in the late 1990s by the Vermont Department of Corrections to encourage more community involvement with the corrections population and to create community-based restorative justice approaches to address wrongdoing. In the year 2000, it was codified in Vermont Statute Title 24, Chapter 58. So now we are legally in existence, I guess, and receive funding from the Vermont Department of Corrections, and all offer restorative justice-based programs that serve people who cause harm and people who have been harmed. The programs span the criminal legal continuum from resolving conflicts like community mediation and dispute resolution programs, pre-charge programs, reparative panels for people on probation, circles of support and accountability for high-risk people returning to the community from incarceration. And all of these programs are restorative justice-based and center the needs of survivors. So, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, that was great. I'll just add that, I mean, every CJC does it a little bit differently, but all of them work with youth and adults. So at the Burlington Community Justice Center, I work with the BARGE program that mostly, it stands for Balance and Restorative Justice. It's funded by DCF. And mostly we work with folks who are on probation, but we can also work with folks who are at risk of being justice involved. And I've worked with folks as young as 12. Some BARGE programs across the state have work with people even in elementary school and younger. So yeah, I'm sad that.
Anything else to add? Good. So let's shift now to Act 11, and I think Erin, maybe you'll help us with this question, but can you tell us about Act 11 and how did we get to it? What does it look like now?
Well, I'd be happy to talk about the legal structure of Act 11 and some of the history during this past legislative session's lawmaking that ended up in Act 11. But I would like to kind of kick it to Karen to talk a little bit about, if you could just expand a little bit on that history, that part of the story where, your initial thoughts about restorative justice for domestic violence or sexual violence cases, and why, what your concerns were, and then how that shifted and how that then informed what we saw this session. And then I can talk about the legal structure.
Great, thanks so much, Erin. I think that one of the things to understand is the movement up until the mainstream movement, which is the movement that I'm part of, up until around 2010, 2013, 2015, we really believed in a uniform approach to answering the call for justice and answering the call for accountability where domestic and sexual violence is concerned. As I mentioned before, we were shocked to learn that Lee Goodmark disagreed with us, and we disagreed with her for quite some time, and she finally did convince us. Her second book was also foundational to our understanding, in that it presented so many really good data points and data sets. And it was what she was talking about was exactly what we were seeing in communities here in Vermont. So what we know in Vermont is that between 60 and 80% of survivors of domestic and sexual violence never call the police. And simultaneously, domestic violence is the most frequent call to police. So there's this significant gap in the reality that domestic and sexual violence are a really big deal in terms of public safety, and also that many, many, many people don't want to have any involvement with that system. They want other approaches. And when we started listening to that, and really specifically listening to people from marginalized communities here in Vermont and across the country, what we were hearing was that there were people that were just not getting anything in the form of support around justice. And so we became really convinced that we had to identify and explore the possibility of doing something as an alternative. Now, this isn't to say it's a replacement, because when somebody calls the police, they're calling the police for a good reason, and we really need the police and the prosecutors and the courts to understand that dynamic and to be able to respond appropriately, responsibly, and using best practices. So we're still promoting that idea, but we have to build out alternatives. And I think in 20 years, our descendants are going to say, what were they thinking? This is so narrow and this is, so limited. But the one thing I do want to say is that when we think about how we got to Act 11, this was a long, long process that involved the Legislative Study Committee, tons of conversations, so sorry, with survivors trying to learn. I really beg your pardon, I never have this on, and for some reason I have it on right now. Talking with lots and lots of survivors, and also across the country, and really specifically listening to advocates and survivors from communities of color who were really worried about how any law that created yet another pathway into the criminal legal system would be so limiting, if not damaging, to their communities. So that's, sets the stage for our conversations in the legislature earlier this year.
Right, and so then this session, when it wasn't Act 11 at the time, it was H41. So House Bill 41 was introduced. It was contemplated that really it was pretty simple. All it was intending to do was to get rid of the prohibition on community justice centers from getting domestic or sexual violence case referrals. And in that, it contemplated that there would be a series of kind of 8 protocols or 8 guideposts that would inform what the programming would need to look like if this prohibition were lifted. And those 8 protocols were to be embedded in memorandums of understanding between a community justice center and a network member organization. So you had this partnership between community justice centers and then the DV and SV experts working together to create programming that had a restorative approach for these kinds of cases. And the 8 protocols included things like making sure that that it was voluntary for victims to participate, that it was very victim-centered, and not just like, we care a lot about victims, but very much the individual person and what their needs are. And also other protections like confidentiality measures and ensuring that there was proper training for everybody involved. That's how H41 looked at the beginning. Fairly simple, with really important protections in place for CJCs to be able to take these kinds of cases. Nothing was mandated. Nowhere in the bill did it say DV and SV cases have to go through a restorative process. It was just to allow those programs to be built. Over the course of the legislative session, so between January and May, a lot of stakeholders came to the table, and a lot of concerns were shared with the legislature. There were a lot of meetings, there were a lot of hallway conversations, and over the course of those several months, the bill evolved. So H41 was 3 pages. What we ended up with Act 11 is 7 pages. And one of the big shifts that happened over the course of this legislative session was that several entities, agencies, stakeholders really wanted to see that there was some kind of not just protocols and guidelines, but kind of a government oversight body to be paying attention to what was happening with these programs, what's happening on the ground in our communities, and to be ensuring that any MOU, any program was in compliance with the law. And so when you start thinking about government oversight and compliance and the criminal legal system, that's when the idea gets floated that maybe the Attorney General's office should be involved. And that's where I work, and I was at the table as part of these conversations. And it was proposed that the Community Justice Unit of the Attorney General's office kind of provide this government oversight, which I was all too happy to do. And when I think of oversight, I think of support. I think of how can we honor the original intent of H41, which is really to have these programs be built in communities based on community needs from the ground up, while I can just help support that, or my colleagues in the Attorney General's office can help support that. So that was my goal. That is my goal. That remains my goal. And there's a lot of rules for me to be following in this 7-page bill. With those 8 protocols still exist about training, that we're thinking about approaches that are already being used around the country or in Vermont, and basing the new programs on evidence and those already successfully running programs, that there's confidentiality measures, et cetera. And so in terms of Act 11's implementation now, we're all very busy working together on drafting guidance for the Memoranda of Understanding, and making sure that in doing that, in creating this guidance, that still we're listening to community members, we're listening to the people on the ground in the community justice centers, we're listening to our experts on domestic and sexual violence, and that's how we're building the program. Even though I'm up here at the Attorney General's office, I think we're working hard together to make sure that this is still really a community-driven effort.
You know, I would add to that, Erin, that we do have an advisory committee for this work that's comprised of people from communities
Yes.
across Vermont.
Yeah.
So that's
Precisely.
one of the ways that we're really trying to embed community-based values in the process.
And part of that advisory board, by design, is made up, in addition to people from community justice centers, people from network member organizations, also advocates for various demographic populations in Vermont, like the LGBTQIA community, or we have an advisory member from the NAACP. And so we're trying to, again, to honor what we heard about how survivors were not being served necessarily very well in the traditional criminal legal response.
I have a question. So as it relates to the advisory board, does that include people who have caused harm and people who have experienced harm as well, as far as community members?
I don't know that we purposefully sought out advisory board members who have caused harm or who have experienced harm. I can say in terms of people who've experienced harm, the statistics would show that everybody at the table, given the number of us at the table, certainly many of us are survivors.
Right.
And that in terms of the phase we're at now in drafting and creating this guidance, we're still at I wouldn't say the earliest phase, but we're kind of like in the beginning, middle-ish part, where we still are going to be seeking out input from other focus groups like survivors, like law enforcement, state's attorneys, and it would probably behoove us to hear from folks who've harmed others and who've experienced what restorative justice can provide.
Yeah, well, I think that the system that we're developing is going to be closely related to the system of programs that are designed to help people who cause harm in intimate partner relationships change their behavioral patterns. So there's going to be, I think there'll be a real link, and Martha knows a lot about that.
That's true.
I would also argue that most of us have caused harm in our intimate partner relationships. I think when we have these conversations, we think about intimate partner terrorism, and that, yes, I think we should hear from those folks, specifically folks who have transformed their behavior, and we also have to recognize that harm looks like a lot of different things. We probably, all of us have done it.
Thanks, Bessie.
Thanks, Bessie.
Martha, I know that your Community Justice Center collaborated with an organization from NYU to develop a program that works with responsible parties who have caused harm. Can you talk about the Circles of Peace program that was created as an example of restorative responses to DV and SA cases?
Yes, I'd be happy to. So you may wonder, hearing this, that there's been this prohibition, but we have this program in Windsor County. So I wanted to give you a little history about the Circles of Peace program in Hartford. In 2018, there was an International Restorative Justice Conference in Burlington, and Linda Mills and Brianna Barocas from NYU Center for Violence and Recovery gave a presentation on their Circles of Peace programs and the studies they'd done in Utah and Arizona. And I happened to go to that presentation, and David Cahill went to it, and he was the Windsor County State's Attorney at the time. And he left that presentation and he said, we have to do this in Windsor County. What we're doing is not working. We have to try something different. This sounds good. So that was the beginning. And so we understood that the statute wouldn't allow us to provide this program. So we decided to go forward to get approval as a domestic violence accountability program through the Vermont Council for Domestic Violence. And they certify and approve all the domestic violence accountability programs in Vermont. So this was an option. So we formed a working group that included community stakeholders. We understood it had to work in our area, and we invited Linda Mills and Brianna Barocas to White River Junction, and they gave a community forum on Circles of Peace and their work. And, oh, by the way, Linda Mills is now the new president of NYU. So, and the working group also included WISE, which is our network survivor advocacy group, and they've been involved in every step of the way. So we adapted the NYU Circles of Peace model to work in Windsor County. And we applied for certification. In 2019, it was certified as a domestic violence accountability pilot program. And in 2022, it was recertified as a standard domestic violence accountability program. And so we've been fortunate enough to have continued support by our current state's attorney, Ward Goodenough. Thank you very much. So we're continuing, the program is growing, and we're grateful for that and all the help we've had doing it. So just some things I wanted to point out about from the Windsor County State's Attorney policy, just to point out a few things about the need for the program. To promote prompt acceptance of responsibility by the defendant, reward prompt acceptance of responsibility by the defendant, increase opportunities for the victim to participate if they so choose, and increase victim satisfaction with the criminal process by achieving rapid resolution and thereby mitigating financial and emotional stressors. So, in the process we do, it's a circle process both for survivors and for the men who caused harm. So we have parallel tracks. We have circles for survivors and we have circles for the men who caused harm, with the opportunity for them to meet together in a circle if the survivor chooses. And all of our circles have include Abby Tassel, who's an advocate from WISE, and many trained community volunteers like Lynn O'Hara, who's sitting in the audience. Thank you, Lynn. So that's just the basic overview about the program. We've had a lot of wonderful support for it, and we continue to evolve according to the needs, according to working with survivors, and so it's been quite a journey, a wonderful journey.
Martha, is the Circles of Peace program predominantly for people who identify as male or men?
In the certification process, we agreed to work with men who've been convicted of misdemeanor domestic assault with women survivors.
Okay, so could you talk a little bit about like what some of those cases might look like coming in, somebody gets charged with, would it be something like battery, or what are the eligible cases, and then kind of walk us through that process?
Well, we don't, we get the referrals, so the state's attorney's office figures all of that out. Thank you very much. And they are convicted of misdemeanor domestic assault and disorderly conduct.
Okay.
If they complete the Circles of Peace program, it's a deferred sentence, and the domestic is gone, and they end up with a disorderly conduct charge.
I see.
Yeah. So did that answer your question?
Yeah, I was just thinking about like how many, like the structure of the program, like how many circles are there? Does it depend on the individual?
No, the circle, they all go through the same process.
The same process,
Once they
okay.
come to us, the process is the same, yes.
Great.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
How long does the process generally take? Is it different for everybody, or is there kind of like a prescribed program?
There's, the numbers of circles are the same for everybody. So that part of it is prescribed. Well, we do have extra ones because some people have requested more, and sometimes people are in need of more as determined by the probation officer or the survivor or the Circles of Peace team. But they're required to do a standard number, and in between that, there's room to fill in more, have more circles.
Thank you.
Can I ask another question?
Yes.
Okay, good. Can you also describe what the survivor programming is like? So what that circle is like, and what are some of the services that survivors might be able to access as part of the Circles of Peace program?
So the survivors all through the process are kept contacted, informed with the victim's advocate in the state's attorney's office. They're connected to a WISE confidential advocate. Abby, who works with the Circles of Peace, connects with the survivors. So they're offered circles with the community volunteers, the Circles of Peace team, and they support circles. We have done things like brought food to them. We have brought presents for their kids. We helped a woman move. She was panicked and she had to be out of her house very quickly, and we brought volunteers to help her move. So those are the kinds of things that we have done. We do more of support circles for them.
Thank you.
Can I jump in?
Yes. Jump in.
I love Circles of Peace. I'm so glad you're doing it. I think it's a really beautiful example of a way that a community has adapted despite the prohibition, sort of found a loophole. I mean, it's totally certified and totally cool, but so in my work with the BARGE program at the Burlington Community Justice Center, we sort of similarly have found a little bit of a loophole. So because we are funded by DCF, we have been able to take dating and sexual violence cases for youth. And so I primarily work with folks who have caused harm in deepening their understanding of accountability, understanding the root causes of their behavior, and working towards amends in any sense of the word. I think an important example for an offering to survivors at our organization, similar to other CJCs, we have a victim liaison who reaches out to the affected parties, to the survivors, and keeps them, like you were saying, Martha, informed on the sort of things that the person who harmed them is working on, and also has a really real conversation about them with them in terms of where that person is in their accountability, so that they can know that maybe it'll provide some closure for them to know that this person is just, maybe flat out denying it, or, denying, minimizing, and blaming. And so that's an important offering, though it's a hard one. And we also think about the ripple effect of harm. So my colleague, who's our victim liaison, worked with a young woman who had a really disheartening, disappointing experience with another organization during her time sharing her story and seeking support after sexual assault. And my colleague offered to do a circle with that person, with the survivor and the organization that caused her harm, and specifically with the worker, bearing in mind power imbalances. But we can think really, really expansively about this. It doesn't just have to involve the person who caused the harm. It doesn't have to have anything to do with them at all.
Thank you. What do we envision as the role of community justice centers and community stakeholders in bringing RJ practices to DV and SV cases?
Well, I can jump in here with our thinking about this very question. So there's so many things that we should know. First of all, we are so fortunate in our state to have this system of community justice centers filled up with really brilliant, dedicated people who care deeply about individuals and communities in our state. And we have this set of organizations that serve survivors and victims of domestic and sexual violence who are equally filled with dedicated and brilliant people. And all of them are really keen to create a community-based approach to this alternative approach to justice. These people are really good at collaborating. So fortunate to know this. They're really great at collaborating, good at sitting at tables with people and finding common ground and finding ways forward and keeping at it. Very tenacious group of people. So we see this as this opportunity to create these formal collaborations within communities where there's an ongoing commitment to cross-training, there's an ongoing commitment to case collaboration, there's an ongoing commitment to learning about how do we actually embody restorative practices in our everyday work, in our everyday lives. We're so heartened with the dedication of the Attorney General's office and pleased to be able to work with them, knowing that it was not the original vision for this law and this approach, but it's one that I think will work very well. So far, so good, right? These individual communities are encouraged to create teams that include whoever they consider to be important. And so that's going to vary across communities. But I do want to make one note. Systems tend to create this kind of vortex of energy, and I work in a system, and we can really center ourselves in the creation of policies and approaches, practices, and standards. And so one of the things that we're really pushing back on is assumptions about who should be at the table. If we're going to really focus on the needs of survivors as we develop this approach, we have to be completely willing to know that in some cases we will need a lot of systems people, and in some cases we will not. But the needs of the survivor are paramount. We're really resisting the temptation to create new community collaborative systems when all the communities in our state already have domestic and sexual violence task forces that are under-resourced and frankly under-attended. And so we have to ask ourselves the question, how do we take our limited resources and how do we invest in this approach in ways that are meaningful for survivors? And it's a challenge for us because we are a system and systems center themselves. The intention of Act 11 is to create alternatives to the system to the criminal legal system that are successful and where survivors can find the kind of supports that you're talking about, Martha, where communities have the kinds of standards that you've developed in collaboration with the State's Attorney's Office in Windsor County, and where people can change, where people have the opportunity to change. And that's foundational to the assumption about what will happen next. I mean, let's be honest. What we're doing works sometimes, and sometimes it really doesn't. And I know at the network, we've spent a lot of time asking ourselves the question, like recognizing what you said, Bessie, that we all cause harm, and asking ourselves the question, can people change? And if we believe that people can change, then why not try? Why not give this a try?
Can I just add to what when you're talking about systems and how systems can act kind of like a vortex, and the people in power, often find themselves at the center. I agree that there is kind of like this force that happens because we have governments, and governments are supposed to be helping people, but part of the challenge that I think Act 11 is trying to address, or any response to domestic or sexual violence, is the reluctance of victims to seek help from the system or from the government. And so, when I think about trying to support Act 11 and what we envision Act 11 providing, part of it is that I hope that more people feel like they have a place to go when they need help, and that it's not going to be detrimental, that they're not worried about maybe a breadwinner being deported, or they're not worried about whether what they want is something different from vengeance, let's say. And when you talk about listening to survivors, those are some of the things that were talked about over and over again, was people reluctant to turn to the system for help because they didn't ever experience the system as helpful.
Thank you. No, I was going to say, any other thoughts?
I want survivors to be able to show up on our doorsteps and ask for help, but I also want the people who cause harm to be able to show up and ask for help. Those folks are survivors too, and we have to do this balance. When we're thinking about harm and immediate harm, but we don't end violence unless we help those people too. And it is inherently survivor-informed and centered to be doing that transformative work with people who cause harm.
Thanks, Bessie. I appreciate the thought of needing both parties really to participate and to make this work. Are there other programs or parts of programs that may be helpful models for Vermont Community Justice Centers as we look to kind of create this response through restorative justice?
Yeah, I mean, my first thought goes to that people have been doing this in communities forever, Black and brown communities in particular, who have not been able to safely access the systems that we have. And so there are a lot of grassroots transformative justice movements that we should look to. I also think about Indigenous peacemaking and being mindful not to be appropriative, but to borrow some of the ideals around when someone causes harm, their family is responsible for helping them steer into accountability too. And so some of those culture shifts, I think are important to look to. And very specifically at the Burlington Community Justice Center, we have looked a lot to the Ahimsa Collective, which is a really, really fabulous organization who has a program, an RJ program for folks who have caused and experienced sexual assault that is totally disconnected from the legal system. So that's a really wonderful organization to look into, and they've been really great thought partners for us.
Thank you.
And I don't know the names of all of the programs and all of the different permutations of all of the approaches. I'm kind of new to learning a lot about restorative justice, but I will say that I keep coming across different approaches or programs or services or just groups of people who are doing restorative justice, and oftentimes they'll say, well, we weren't calling it that, but we've been doing this for a very long time. And so you hear about those, and they might not be like in the data and in the reporting, but certainly when we hear about those, when we hear stories from those kinds of community efforts and service provision, we listen.
The network is also doing a training on the 9th, and I don't know if it's full. There was,
I don't know either.
it was pretty popular, but there's a training with some really fabulous national RJ practitioners, Sujatha Baliga, Erica Saison, and who was the last one?
Faculty here? And I don't remember the last one. This is me
Shame.
in threes.
Shame.
Yeah.
Anyway, we can maybe send that out. Can we send? I don't know how to send it out.
Can send
you?
it to me.
Okay, I'll send it to you. Okay.
Yeah.
It was pretty popular. There were a lot. I think the cap was 500, and a couple weeks ago there were 250 people registered. So get on it. Or I'm so sorry I brought it up, and maybe next time. I don't know.
I will pass
Look
it
at
on.
Bessie doing the work of the network already.
I think one reason that this webinar is so popular and we get so many questions and interest in Act 11 is because it's not that restorative justice approaches to community harm is new, but certainly there is some trailblazing going on when you start codifying things and when you start thinking about structures and embedding these approaches in laws. And so I'm not surprised to hear that there's a lot of people who are signing up for this webinar. And I think there's jurisdictions across the country, not just towns in Vermont, that are paying attention to what we're doing here.
Mm-hmm.
So at this time, I'd really like to open it up into some conversation between the audience and our panelists. And I do know we have online guests too, but I'm wondering if anybody in the room has questions. We have state's attorneys here, we have students, we have volunteers. So raise your hand, Nancy will give you the mic, and we'll get started.
Hi, thank you all so much for coming and being here. I'm really excited about early intervention programs, and I'm wondering how those look different than adult programs and the extra hurdles of getting access to, minors and working in schools and things like that.
There's so many things I could say. I can say that at the Burlington Community Justice Center, we have an RJ practitioner that is based in one of our middle schools, and she has been tasked with specifically helping to decrease disparities in suspensions for youth, racial disparities specifically. And so there's that, and then I think specifically when we're thinking about dating and sexual violence, yes, big fan. Let's get at it right when it comes to us before there's more harm. I think it is inherently trickier. I think it's can be really wonderful, and it's so important to have caregivers involved, and also young people are the product of their environments, and sometimes caregivers are causing harm, or maybe just aren't equipped with the skills that they need to be able to talk about dating, relationship, green flags and red flags. Yeah, I'm with you. Let's keep doing it. Let's get after it.
Hi. I was wondering, hearing you talk about Act 11, I know that a problem with getting a lot of RJ programs codified is that there isn't a lot of data about success rates. And I was wondering if Act 11 includes a model for record keeping and ongoing data collection.
Oh, you know it does, because the government's on the scene. And we love data. Yes, they're one of the 8 protocols that must be in every memorandum of understanding between the CJC and the network member organization. One of those 8 protocols is about data collection. And then also, I have to report to the legislature not every 2 years, but in Act 11, I have to make one report before July 1st, 2025, I believe, December 1st, 2025, and then another one July 1st, 2028. And that report has to include the status of the implementation of programming, the referral sources, and any available data on effectiveness. So it is envisioned that there will be data collection and then also reporting based on that data.
And if I could just add to that, we are really building this system from the ground up, and so we can't necessarily look to other states to know what the outcomes should be or what the data set should be. We're figuring this out. We are working with a researcher at the University of Vermont to help us out with that, because we think that we actually will have a lot of information 3 years from now for our colleagues across the country to take a look at.
That's the hope. And 2, when we're talking about data, not just quantitative data, but qualitative data. And then that question about data on effectiveness. What does effectiveness mean? Right. I mean, I think to some degree, the people who use the programs get to define what effective means. But that is also part of the interesting questions we're asking ourselves right now.
Can I say one more thing about youth?
Yeah.
Just. Well, 2 things. So working with young people who cause this type of harm, it's been deeply healing and rattling and wonderful and terrifying. And I've come to realize that youth really are deeply, profoundly capable of change. And that's really, really special to see. And they are willing to be challenged in a way that I didn't expect. Challenged in a conversation, challenging their worldview. And so that's really wonderful. And I think for youthful survivors, they've got a lot to say, and there's a lot of adults who don't want them to say it or don't know what to do with it or how to hold it. And so I could go on. I won't.
You can.
Thank you.
Bobby.
Thank you all. Well, I have a recollection, point of clarification, and a question. Karen, my recollection of Lee Goodmark's talk and your reaction was different than yours, and I'm going to watch the video. Because I think you had already made this
I have
change
that
in
same
approach.
recollection.
I remember you standing over
A lot
here.
of argument that led to that, I can guarantee you.
Okay.
So much outrage.
Point of clarification, Martha, your program is post-conviction, but Act 11 would allow community-based responses before a case has ever gone to court. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Okay.
A case that may never go to
Yes.
court.
Right.
Right.
It could be somebody just walks into the community justice center and says, I need help. I haven't reported this to anybody and I don't want to, but I trust you.
Right. So the legislature had erected a barrier to IPV, interpersonal violence cases, going to community-based responses. That barrier has been removed. And I'm wondering, particularly Erin and Karen, thinking more broadly in terms of legislative strategy and anyone here who might want to become a legislative advocate. Do you have any advice on how to work that transformation?
Listen. I mean, so much of what led to Act 11 was about listening to what survivors need, listening to what people who do harm need to make change, and storytelling. I would say also relationship building, and being willing to compromise and take a step-by-step approach and build from there.
And the only thing I would add is you're in it for the long haul.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a long-term process.
And it's so fun. So I highly recommend it.
Mike's
Go on.
coming, Tony.
Does Tony need a mic?
I probably don't, but just, I was listening to you, and I'm just curious, how effective do you anticipate Act 11, will be with the idea of the 8 protocols, and also, achieving restorative justice principles, because I'm listening, and I understand it's a law, but how do you anticipate it will be effective in its efforts? Is that clear? Is that unclear?
Super clear to me.
Okay.
Super clear to me, because here's the thing. So first of all, we have the experience of domestic violence accountability programs, which are called different things in other states, batterers intervention programming. For a really long time, we allowed outcomes for that kind of programming to be based on whether or not the person involved in the program went back to prison, was rearrested, or, so recidivism was the outcome. We were hearing from survivors all the time that even if their abusive partner went back, was rearrested, things were still better, but there was no way to capture that data. So this idea that we're from the very beginning capturing data, I think will give us a better picture of whether or not we're really effective, and not just capturing quantitative, but as Erin said, qualitative data as well. But here's the other thing. So I think we're actually world building here in Vermont. I think we are shifting the paradigm about how we see people who cause harm, and in that, how we see ourselves. And I think, I'm an optimist and maybe a little bit of a Pollyanna, but I actually think that we are on to something that will change our world, especially when we're talking to kids about it. We've got a whole generation of kids who expect to go into circles when there's conflict. They anticipate it, they know how to do it. And even though they might say, "Oh, I have to do this to get out of trouble," we don't have to pay any attention to that cynicism, whether it's real or not. I think that this paradigm shift offers a completely different way of how we relate to each other, and how lucky are we to be in Vermont to try this grand experiment. So I have a lot of faith that we will be successful. We're going to learn a lot, and we're going to be surprised at some of it. And I don't want to minimize the fact that some people who use violence in their intimate partner relationships are super dangerous, really dangerous. And we have the tools that we need to be able to recognize who those folks are, and we have the tools that we need to be able to intervene as quickly as possible for those people. We have all the tools, we just need the will and the resources. But I think there's great hope. There's so much hope for this.
I'm going to ask a question. I'm Nancy. I'm a mental health provider here, and for 10 years before coming here to Vermont, I did psychotherapy with domestic violence, sexual assault survivors. I have a lot of concern And my concern is around a couple of different things. One, we do know that in America, 50% of women who are murdered by a current or past partner. 50% of homicides.
True here too.
So I assume Vermont is the same. So that's pretty frightening. That's pretty startling. I will say one of the things that because I've been mulling about this for a number of days. I think I need to have an understanding of the difference between a misdemeanor DV and a felony DV. And when I think about the people that I work predominantly with in Milwaukee, Wisconsin for 10 years, 70% of them had been strangled. At least 30% of them had had a gun put to them. So that level of danger, that level of trauma to the survivor is where my work was based. So I come to this with all of that, all of their stories. I think one of the things that really is concerning is that when do we ask survivors, what is it that you want? What have we provided to survivors that allows them to make at that time what they hope is their best decision about what they want? I used to compare working with DV survivors as they would get dropped into the Category 5 hurricane with their abuser. And all they wanted to do was survive the moment. And I was sort of like the meteorologist with the satellite imaging. And I had an understanding of what was happening. And over time, as a therapist, and the luxury of being grant funded, and I didn't have to worry about how many appointments I did with them, they began to get that satellite image of what they had been going through and what their life, what had happened in their life because of that. And so I worry around what are we giving to survivors, offering to them with regard to their own healing from trauma, so that they can make the most educated the most educated choice with regard to what they need.
Thank you, Nancy. I want to point out that the current system, if we look at outcomes, the current system means that 50% of the homicides in this state are related to domestic violence. So something's not going right, right? It's a good question. What we've talked about in terms of Act 11 actually builds on the services and supports that are already in place in communities through domestic violence organizations, as well as through private therapists and mental health systems. And of course, my 30 years in the movement, I've talked to many, many survivors, and like it unfolds. We all, you talk about it like you just like peel the layers. None of that goes away with a restorative justice opportunity. It actually is just an alternative. It's a different pathway. The same level of support will be available. And I think, when we're talking about building a restorative justice system that is fundamentally, from the very first day, focused on survivors, we know that the stories will change, and we know that they may want to change their relationship with it over time, and we can accommodate that. Domestic and sexual violence are hugely harmful to the individuals who experience it, to the individuals who cause it, and to the community, the families, communities, state where they live. And we can know, as Bessie said, that people come to engage in violence in their relationships on a pathway that often starts with being abused themselves. So we can hold their humanity. We can understand how they got there while simultaneously promoting safety, while simultaneously promoting healing and change. That's all possible. It's possible for us, and it's possible for people who cause harm, and it's possible for survivors. I think that this is not an approach that will necessarily work for everybody. But I will say there's this little program up in Duluth, Minnesota at Menace Peacemakers. And at that program, they're doing healing circles with people who cause harm and with survivors. And the people that they work with are very specifically people who have been convicted of felonies, they've served time, they've failed everything. They failed everything. And they're doing really effective work and helping people change their behavior and supporting survivors all at the same time. So there's, again, I'm hopeful. I'm very hopeful.
I appreciate the question. I appreciate your response. I don't think of this as opening the floodgates. I think that we, communities will, CJCs and network partners will begin this work when they are ready. I don't think any of us will ever be fully ready. But we together, the collective we, the people involved in a process, can say no. We can say that won't work, but how about this? We can say this is how this person is showing up. This is what we're concerned about. How do you feel about it? You know better than we do. And Fania Davis, when she's talking about police violence, but says something that I think is really important that I think applies here, is that we're not looking at a roadmap, we're just looking at signposts. Right, so like safety being at the core, safety for everyone, and if we're able to just reorient ourselves to those signposts all the time, we're gonna mess up. But failure is data, and I know that we can be talking about really dangerous, really, really scary things, but I trust us to do it.
One thing I was thinking of in our work, so it's true, survivors say, I don't know what I want, I don't need anything, I don't want to be involved. Those are all fine options. We don't know. Sometimes we learn more later. But often we hear, I just want him to get better. And so this is an opportunity, at least, for him to get better.
I do have a question from our audience on the web. What is the biggest difficulty in reframing the perspective of those who push back on the idea of using RJ practices with DV/SV and making sure all parties involved are supported during healing?
Can you read that again? Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Yeah, it seems like a two-parter.
Yeah, maybe, yeah. Start with part one.
You guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. What is the biggest difficulty in reframing the perspective of those who push back against the idea of using RJ practices with DV and SV and making sure all parties who are involved are supported during healing?
I think Karen alluded to the need for reframing when she was talking about systems and how systems have a life of their own and system players can feel very assured about their importance to responses to harm. And I think the best, most effective way to reframe is storytelling. I think when you hear from people who've experienced harm and they've experienced a lack of response that helped them from the traditional legal system, I think those stories reframe everything.
You know, I'm reflecting on the legislative process and the many, many voices that we heard, and we were so surprised to hear those voices that were in opposition of this idea. And I remember thinking to myself over and over again, wow, the network has done such a great job of educating people. And I could see that so many of our beloved partners were completely stumped by this change of heart on the part of the network and really surprised by it. But really what sat for me in hearing those testimonies was there was a lot of fear, fear that that systems would be, because let me just say, I'm talking about systems in the abstract. The systems are filled with really good people. I mean, beloved partners. People have dedicated their lives to doing work, important work, dangerous work. And we can still, love them and disagree with them all at the same time. But there was a lot of fear about if we do this, people are going to die. And the truth is people are already dying. And it's not, I don't stand in the network or the Attorney General or any of us stand in the way of somebody being killed. In every single homicide in the state, we can see that the person who caused that ultimate harm was going to do it, right? And they had the tools to be able to do it, and many times we missed opportunities to step in. So I think that's one of the big challenges. And also, this is it's a paradigm shift and a messaging shift on the part of the domestic and sexual violence movement. When we're saying, for 50 years, we've been saying, lock them up and throw away the key, no matter how severe the harm was. And now we're saying, maybe people can change. Maybe we should make an investment and have some belief in the ability of people to change. That's a big paradigm shift. And then the second part of that question, Nancy, I'm sorry, could you read it one more time?
Before we get to part two, can I add too, and I think the other reframing is to step away from some kind of either-or response.
Both and.
Yeah, and yes, thank you, Lisa, to both and. And it's not like, you could choose a restorative approach through Act 11, or you could go through the traditional criminal legal system. That's not at all the goal or the intent of Act 11 or how we as a collective want to be addressing harm. What we would like to see is options that are victim-centered, that hold people in their humanity, that hold people accountable, that create opportunities for change. And we think that could be threaded throughout our justice system, not just over here is the Act 11 door, over here is the courthouse door. We all really need to be working collectively to help our communities.
Nancy, can you repeat the second part of that question, right?
Oh yeah, there was part two.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I think the question essentially comes down to what are we doing to make sure that all parties involved are supported during healing?
Listening.
These experts over here.
Well, we have just lots of points where there are people that reach out to survivors. In the state's attorney's office, in our local network agency, in our Circles of Peace program, and they're given information and voice and choice. And so a lot of that is happening for survivors and a parallel process for them. So I would hope that in all of this, the needs of survivors, or what they need, what they want, would be told to whatever person they're talking to. So, and we do a parallel process with the men who caused harm too, as far as not so many intercepts where we have people reaching out to them, but the probation officer in our office certainly do that. Yeah.
Other questions?
This gentleman over here has had his hand.
Jonathan?
My name is Jonathan Tuttle, and
She's got the mic.
thank you. My name is Jonathan Tuttle, and I have the privilege of working with an outlaw and a leader in my community. And I get to witness people going through this process. And one of the things that I have just want to appreciate for everyone that I think is much different is I see this as an added tool to many systems. And I work with folks some of the offenders through a housing program, but I get to see them grow where they get to save face. What the Community Justice Center, we're using victims and survivors, but it really kind of melts away, it melts away as people go through the process. And it's amazing to witness. I'm not in the meetings. I sit at my desk sometimes, or I come in late, or I greet people, or I hear conversations outside the office, and you can just see people come in sometimes tense, see them relax, and for growth and transition and change to take place, first, we have to feel safe, right? It has to be okay to realize that you have to change, and that's what I see Circles of Peace do, is it, if man search for meaning, if we give people a why, this gives them a how. This adds to that. So thank you. I just want to appreciate that, because as we talk about systems, like we have a lot of great systems, we have a lot of excellent programs, but people need a place to digest that, and I think that's what this is. And I just want to remind folks, I am a Vermonter. I have all 6 in the ground. My Aunt Ev actually raised the money for the arch. Vermont has always been a state full of leaders. When the Depression happened, that was a Sunday for Vermont. Other people came to learn from us. So thank you all for your leadership, because that's Vermont. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Jonathan.
I have a question about how COVID affected this, but...
Do you really want to know? How did COVID affect
I don't want
this?
to take it away, but I am curious how that's played out as the courts open back up. But I can ask Hartford.
We do have another question from the audience, the online audience. Do you think this will support an increase in reporting over time?
Don't care. It's not an outcome that I personally am looking for. What I'm interested in is if it supports that kind of transformation.
Katie. Nancy, we have a question over here.
Thank you, Nancy. So I am a CJC volunteer, and on the CJC side, it sometimes feels like kind of a black box which cases get sent to the CJCs. And I know that this is just like such a wonderful opportunity for meaningful recovery, but also the opportunity to not have a criminal record and everything. And I'm just wondering if there are any efforts being made to make sure that that's an opportunity available to everybody, sort of regardless of some historically limiting factors. And I'm also wondering if you guys are going to collect demographic data along with other data that you're collecting to make sure that this program is actually reaching everybody.
Well, I can tell you that Act 11 is not a mandate for there to be an Act 11 program in every single county. That what Act 11 does is provide a framework for communities within which communities could build out these offerings. And I agree with you that it's concerning to think that the kind of response that you could get from your community or the criminal justice system or your government might depend on where you live in Vermont. And so there's all kinds of decision points along the way that can lead to that kind of geographic disparity. I mean, in our current system, prosecutors have a lot of discretion about whether and when to refer cases to a CJC or to a diversion program, how to charge. So certainly there's just going to be discretion in the system that is going to play a role. But the goal of Act 11 is to make it possible for every community to build these programs. And yes, we will be collecting data like that you described, like what does the rollout look like across Vermont? What does the demographic data look like? And then we can just hope that this is kind of, we're planting seeds and that the programs will build up across Vermont and will inform each other about how to do that successfully.
Any other questions? Jonathan?
I'm curious as you look at the system, if anybody's looked at systems to support the families, specifically like the women in their development.
Sorry, I can't hear you.
Plentiful,
Yeah.
I was wondering, since you mentioned systems, if anybody's looking at what it would take, like, for other systems to step in to support the home, and just in transitional housing, as I've looked lately, we have a lot of the women who have jobs that don't pay quite enough to buy a home. But I was wondering if anybody's looked at that. I know with housing, is there a way to tie it in to support, I don't know, the women specifically or the family to keep it together, but to empower maybe the powerless or the victim, whoever that might be. But that home ownership is a big thing, and I don't know, just other systems to empower them and give them a way out.
I mean, that specific idea is not embedded in the language of Act 11, but that kind of thinking and those kinds of ideas from community members, we are hoping inform the kind of programs and services that people could access through restorative programs and community justice centers in partnership with member organizations, for sure. So go talk to your community justice center.
Well, I would add that those domestic and sexual violence organizations are very much involved in economic empowerment and helping folks find safe and affordable long-term housing, including transitional housing. And many of the shelter models right now in Vermont are transitioning from that old, Lifetime movie model where you've got an old frame house where people are living communally toward a more transitional housing model where people are in single-family units, in apartments or in homes, and are able to maintain that housing for a much longer period of time.
I'll add too on I love the question, I love the thinking. And on the advisory board, we have Julie Riley, who is the supervisor of the domestic violence unit at DCF. And she's all about always asking those questions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Is there anybody from VHCB or the Housing Board or Housing Trust involved, like the affordable housing community? And I'm going to stop because I'll.
Yeah. Not directly on the advisory. I can say that I work with somebody whose job it is to liaison with that group of people, and actually she does an awful lot of work with them. So we have access to that that expertise.
I have kind of a looking forward question for the on-the-ground people, but I'm wondering if any of your organizations are starting to look at surrogate programs when one of the parties is not as interested in restorative justice as the other party is?
Yes, but no real movement. It's more we're in the philosophical thinking stage around it. But for folks who don't know, some places do surrogate RJ processes. So somebody, a survivor meeting with a person who caused harm to someone else, maybe 20 years after the harm happened. And I will say, so not quite there, but certainly thinking about it, there are surrogate type programming happening at CJCs already. So maybe at a DUI impact circle, somebody who lost a family member to a drunk driver is sharing their story. And so that's happening in some ways. And I would also, feels a little bit scandalous to say, but argue that some of this work is surrogacy work, and that most of the folks drawn to this work are drawn to it for a reason, have experienced harm themselves, and can't offer their unique experience or get too much into it. But I just think we're talking about us, and we need to remember that. We're talking about all of us.
I think we have time for one more question. Anybody online, Nancy? Run. Oh, the gentleman in the back.
Here you go.
Thanks very much. First of all, I have to note that there are no men up there, which is interesting.
Isn't it?
Secondly, I think it's a great step forward for Vermont, And I can imagine the day where you have a police officer responding and their directions are not, somebody's got to be arrested. Maybe their response is, they will be aware that violence is a direct outcome of a lack of patience, and they will be able to call in a trained restorative justice facilitator. So here's to dreaming.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
You know, I really appreciate your comment that violence is related to a lack of patience. I would take that a step further, and I would say that violence is the inevitable result of a loss of spirit. And so that's what this approach offers us, is restoration of spirit.
Perfect note to end on.
I would like to say something as a man, because I go to a lot of things out in the field. I've often shopped with our aren't more men in the field, and I've chosen at least twice to stay in the field because of that. So I would challenge that. Why aren't there more men up there? It's not these ladies' faults. Where are the fathers? Because that is one thing that keeps me in this work and makes me love it. Who is calling out the fathers? So, thank you.
Can I just say, I appreciate that perspective, and I think it's important for us to recognize that the women sitting in front of this audience are people that, 30 years ago, this would be all men.
Thank you all so much. Thank you for our in-person audience, our online audience, and to our amazing panelists. Thank you all so much for being here. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.